So for the last 5 weeks or so, we've been looking at Romans 9 to 11, and we come to a conclusion today. And really, we've been kind of orbiting around two questions. The one that is probably the more surface question that Paul raises at the very beginning of our passage is, what do we do with the confusing story of Israel? Israel, God's people that God has said again and again that he loves. Israel, the people that God has promised to be with them. How is it that Israel could now reject Jesus? And what Paul shared in the passage last week we saw is that though from a human perspective it looks like God has done with Israel, he is not. That God is still saving people from Israel, and one day there will be this glorious conclusion of saving the people of God. So that's one question. But there's a second question that has been kind of maybe a more universal, broad question that we've been feeling up against, and that is, what do we do with doubt? What do we do when it seems like we find reason to not trust God, or at least it seems that way? What do we do when it actually seems like it might not even be the case that God is real? I mean, Christianity says that the very heart of being a Christian, when we are made most whole, when we're made most human, is when we worship the true God. So how do we do that if we don't even know if God is true? How do we do that when we doubt? It seems to me that this is an especially pertinent question for our day, wouldn't you say? I mean, if you know anything about human history, you know for almost the entire course of human history, almost everyone, everywhere, has believed that there is some sort of God. Almost everyone, everywhere, has come to the conclusion that what we see is not all there is. But that's changed in the last couple of centuries. Atheism, though it's still very much a minority position, is much more popular than it once was. But more importantly, with that has come this broad sense of uncertainty, of religious confusion. How can we know? How can we know anything about God if we can't scientifically demonstrate that? There are just so many questions, so many reasons for doubts. Like, isn't it possible that we just made this God up because we kind of need him to exist? There's a philosopher in the 19th century by the name of Feuerbach who basically makes that argument. Who says, here's what's happened. We have in our own idea a sense of what humanity should be, the ultimate version of humanity who's truly loving, truly kind, truly strong, and to make that a concrete image, we just call that really, really great man God. We make them up because we need to. And have you ever wondered that? That maybe because we're afraid of death, or maybe because we feel like we need meaning, maybe we've just made this idea of God up. Or is there really any good reason to believe in God? There's another philosopher, Bertrand Russell from last century, who argues that it is irrational to believe in God because there just really isn't any proof. And he gives this illustration. He says, imagine someone told you that in the outer space there is a teapot orbiting the sun on the other side of the earth, so you can never see the teapot. And in fact, it's so small that no telescope can ever see it. But believe me, there's that teapot out there. Is there any good reason to believe that? And he says, then why believe in God? People say believe in God, but where's the proof? Where's the evidence? And don't we feel the weight of that? Like, we don't have to be proven that gravity exists. All I need to do is drop this Bible and we know what will happen. We can just demonstrate it through experiment, but we can't do that with God. Is it irrational to believe in God? Or even more than this, are there reasons not to believe in God? Many philosophers, think of or Richard Dawkins, this atheist, who said, if you look at this world, what you see is a world that seems to be without any order, without any good, without any evil, certainly without God. When you see the suffering, how can you believe that there is a good God? And again, don't we feel the weight of this? In our day, it just seems that there's so many reasons to doubt, and how do we worship a God if we feel uncertain about his even existence? So this morning, I do not claim or pretend to think that by the end of the time we're looking at this passage, we'll suddenly come to the point where there's no more reason for doubt or no more confusion in a fallen and broken world. There will always be time when God feels far. But I do want us to notice that actually there's something going on in Romans 9-11 that speaks to this. Because Paul, at the very beginning, the very first thing he does in Romans 9 is he brings something that seems like a reason to doubt God, Israel's failure. But by the time you get to our passage at the end, what do you hear? You hear a song of praise. We go from doubt to doxology. And here's the thing that I think is most interesting, that I think most helps us perhaps as we're wrestling with these questions. What Paul does to bring us through this is raise the question for us to ask ourselves, who is the God that you doubt? When you are feeling uncertain, when you're saying, I'm not sure that this God exists, who is it that you are saying, I'm not sure that he exists? Because there are a whole lot of gods that we should doubt. There are a whole lot of gods that we should disbelieve in. And I would suggest actually that the gods that we were just talking about, that the philosopher says, oh, we shouldn't believe in that, those gods are no more real than Baal or Zeus or the Tooth Fairy. Could it be that one of the reasons that we are struggling to believe in God is that in our minds we have made God less than he truly is? I raise this because in our passage there's a couple really interesting quotes that Paul uses. If you don't have it open, I invite you to have your bulletins open to look. And you'll see there's these two quotes, and both of them are verses that come in the context of doubting. So verse 34, we actually heard earlier in the service, if you might remember, in our call to worship was from Isaiah chapter 40. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Here's what's going on in chapter 40. Israel is despondent and hopeless. They have failed. They have sinned against God. They're in exile, and God is saying, don't worry, I am coming and I will save you. And Israel is like, I don't believe it. I don't see how this could possibly be true. And God says back to them, here's your problem. You think that I'm like you. And you imagine if it was you in my situation, then of course he wouldn't forgive me. But I'm not on your level. I'm not someone that you can give advice to. I'm not someone you can understand. I am God. And so you're not going to understand me. You just have to trust me. You are doubting me because you have shrunk me into something I am not. Or then the following verse, verse 35, where it says, who has given God a gift that he might be repaid? That's from Job. It's imagining whoever has been on God's same level, that God might need to borrow a few dollars from. And if you remember, we talked about this a couple of weeks. Job, who goes through suffering, who feels like God cannot possibly be good, who doubts the goodness of God. What does God do? God comes to him and says, Job, your problem is you think that you know me. You think that you're on the same level as me and that I should make sense to you. But I am God. You doubt me because you have shrunk me into something that I am not. The word to both of these doubters, to Israel and Job, ultimately is the same. You doubt because you want a God, or you believe in a God, or it's easier for you to accept in a God that somehow is on your level, that can make sense, that your mind can comprehend. You've shrunk God into a size that he is not, and then you're surprised that he's not big enough for you. And so you doubt. And I want to suggest that's not just an Israel or a Job thing. That's a human thing. We have this tendency to make God safe by making him smaller. We can see it in the ancient times where you have these idols, these depictions of what God is that makes sense to us, that we can manage and even move around if we want to, but it's not just then. How often have you heard people refer to God in some way like the man in the sky? Well, that's safe and tame. Or perhaps more presently, how often do we see people treating God kind of like a religious buffet? You know, I like this idea of karma in Hindu gods that way, and I like the Zen thing of Buddhism, and I like forgiveness and love. God, I'm going to just kind of put all that together, and that's the God I worship. That is the God that you have made up. We make God a certain way that fits us, and then we're surprised that God is not enough, and that he doesn't seem to stand up to faith. Could it be that when we are doubting God and having a hard time believing him, it is not actually God that we are doubting, but something other than what the Bible tells us? Because I want us to kind of contrast the safe, smaller versions of God with what we see here in this passage. What do we see about God? It says from the very beginning in this song, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God." It's asking us to think about the riches of God, his capacity to give, his generosity. It's asking us to think of the mind of God, the choices he makes and how much he knows, and use almost spatial ways, so depth. Like, imagine it's this massive thing to explore. Maybe think of it as something below us, like this deep mind. What does it say? It says the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God are unsearchable, they're inscrutable, they are unfathomable. There is no bottom to it. I was reading the other day of a cave called Veriovkina. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right or not. It's in Georgia, right near the Black Sea. It's this cave that's in an area where you have limestone deposits, and apparently with limestone deposits, cave become quite possible. And so in the 1960s, it was first discovered, people started exploring it, kept going around and around and down, and they realized this cave goes 100 meters down. We're not talking about just straight down, it's just like the further you go, the deeper you go. 100 meters, that's pretty deep. 15 years later, other spelunkers returned, and at one point they noticed this kind of shaft where steam was coming from, and they realized there's more to this. And so then and it's this kind of really tight squeeze. I get claustrophobic just imagining this, but they started exploring further and further and realized it was 440 meters deep ultimately. You know, that means further down than the Willis Tower. Well, people started paying more attention to it in the early 2000s and started exploring it. At one point, someone noticed that in one of these, like, this is a massive labyrinth, right? At one point, there's a pit that seems to go down further, and so they just, take a rope or whatever spelunkers do when they go down the pit and they realize, oh, there's more passageways. And eventually they realize it's over 1,000 meters deep. And then a couple years later, after more and more exploring, and they say more and more vast geographical things come to us, and there seems to be no end, it was over 2,200 meters deep. That's more than 1.5 miles deep. And again, that's not straight down. That's labyrinths and tunnels and narrow passageways. It takes 3 days to get to the bottom at this point. And the crazy thing to me is they still don't think they've ever gotten to the bottom. There's more to this cave. So why am I talking about this? Well, if you have this cave in your mind, you should recognize that this is nothing more than what a little kid in a sandbox with a plastic shovel can make when you compare to the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. No matter how far you try to explore it, no matter how long you seek to understand it, no matter where you go, there is always, always, always more. I've spent, I think, most of my life having the privilege of being able to study God's Word, studying some of the greatest thinkers about theology that have ever been people that I've been able to either read or interact with. And to a person, every time I see this, and this is my experience as well, the more people seem to know, it's not like they go, okay, I'm getting closer to knowing God truly and fully and completely. No, the more that we come to know about who God is, the more we realize, oh my goodness, there is so much more that I don't understand. He is just so far beyond. There is no bottom to this. If you've been a Christian for a number of years, maybe you've experienced the same when it comes to the generosity and grace of God. When you first become a Christian, you realize, God has forgiven me, even though I've done things wrong. Grace is just this amazing thing. But it's not like grace starts shrinking the more you become a Christian, because the further you go, the more you start realizing how sinful you are. But even more than that, you start realizing just how much bigger God's love was than you ever realized. And the further you go, the bigger and bigger you realize there is no bottom to this. Oh, the depths of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. It is inscrutable. It is unsearchable. There is no bottom. Do you see? We want something that we can get our minds around. That seems safer to us. But the reality is this is something that utterly encompasses us. That God is so far bigger than us. Our mind is just one small thing and something so much greater. Now, maybe at this point you're saying, wait a second, how is it that you can even speak so confidently? Okay, maybe you're right. Maybe we have a problem where we just kind of make God like us. Kind of like Feuerbach is saying. Sure, that seems right. But if you're saying God is so far beyond us, how can we say anything about him? Can't we just say, well, God is so far beyond us, we know nothing. And maybe we'll never know anything about God, and just leave it at that. And that is, in some ways, a correct response to recognize there is no way that humanity will just somehow kind of like figure God out. But what if this God chooses to actually tell us about himself? What if this God of the universe, who's so far beyond our understanding, who is unfathomable, says, I want you to know me? We spoke about Feuerbach and how I think in some ways he's right, that the human tendency oftentimes is to try to make God like us because that's safer and easier, and it works for us. But one of the interesting things about Feuerbach is he falls into the same problem, because when we talk about this idea, sometimes we talk about this doctrine of revelation, that God would choose to reveal himself in his word. Feuerbach's like, that's nonsense. No God would choose to allow people like us to write stuff down. God wouldn't do that. Which you realize, of course, is the exact same problem, because Feuerbach's like, I know who God is. And I know that if God exists, which he does not, but if he did, and he was as great as he is, which he isn't, then he certainly wouldn't write things down for us. But why? How dare we say that God would not choose to do something like show himself to us in his word? And consider for a moment what he says about himself in his word. If we continue on to the very end of this passage, we're reminded, from him and through him and to him are all things. From God and through God and to God are all things. When you reflect on this for a moment, you realize why what Bertrand Russell was talking about with the teapot just is not relevant here. I'm in complete agreement. I am not going to believe in a God that's a teapot. We can at least just stipulate that, right? More than that, I'm willing to believe that we cannot believe in a God who's just part of this universe, like Zeus or Thor, someone who is within this universe that you could... Because if he is, you should be able to have some sort of evidence that he somehow is walking or existing or that kind of thing. But that's not the God that we're talking about. We're not talking about a God who is an object that can be experimented on that's smaller than the universe. We're talking about the one from whom the universe comes. And on one hand, that means you can't just put him under a microscope or experiments. If you're wanting evidence of that God, you need to look at everything, right? Imagine one day you're walking in the middle of a forest that you believe has never been touched by human beings. You're in the middle of nowhere. It's amazing. And you're walking and you look down and you see a Rubik's Cube. The first thing you're going to do is go, how did this 80s toy get here? Right? But see, the funny thing is, actually, we should be asking that question a whole lot more. How did these trees get here? How did the sun get here? Yeah, I know we have stories. We can talk about seeds, and we can talk about process of evolution. We can talk about the Big Bang. But let's go beyond that. Let's keep moving back. How did that get here? How is anything existing at all? Do you realize that's the most basic question? And yet, where's the answer? Why do things exist rather than not exist? And God's like, from me, all things have come. Or think about how this world just keeps ticking along, how it holds together, how it's consistent, so that every day the sun rises, every day gravity works, every day E equals mc squared. Einstein actually said, the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. The fact that it is comprehensible is a miracle. In other words, he's saying, the only thing about this world that doesn't make sense to me is the fact that it makes sense to me. How is it that things keep happening the same way? How is it the laws of physics work? Or think of just even the very fact of thinking. We're in this time of AI where chat GPT, whatever number it is, will kind of simulate it, but it's so obvious that it's not the same thing as thought, right? That it's not the same thing as intention. There's not self-reflection going on. There's no amount of ones and zeros that will suddenly create choices. How is it that we have those choices? How is it that we are conscious? God says, I'm the one who holds things together. You think because I've given you thought. All things are through me. But what about this other problem that we were talking about of suffering? I mean, how do we make sense of that? And again, I think part of the problem is we know what a God who is good would do when we say, well, this shouldn't be. It's again assuming that we are on the same level as God and we could give him advice. But there's even something more that's going on there if you think about it. The very fact that we say, this is bad, what does it say? When we see things like genocide, racism, child abuse, what we don't do is just go, well, that's the natural byproduct of survival of the fittest. We're in a violent world, and that is natural. No, what do we do when we come across that we say, this is wrong, this is evil? And in the same way, when we see things that we see are beautiful, whether it's, just the gentleness that growing up, Mr. Rogers, something like that, or the way that a mother gives her life for her child, or just even the simple delights of friendship. We don't just say, well, my biology and evolution has programmed me to think this is good, but it's just it. No, we go, this is good. This is beautiful. If there is no God, if it's just stuff all the way down, then that is nonsensical, and yet in the depths of our soul we realize that is certain, that there is good, that there is evil. How? Why do we come to that conclusion? God says, I am goodness. I am love. I am beauty, and this created world bends towards me. All things are to me. You see, we have this tame, manageable version of God that can make sense to us because that feels safer, and yet it is ultimately vacuous. It is never going to satisfy. It is never going to be enough to withstand the doubts that sometimes we feel. What we have is not a God that our minds can come around, can comprehend. We have a God who is so much greater. And so on one hand, that means we can't use some sort of mathematical proof because he is the one who made math. We can't do some sort of experiment because he's beyond all of that. And yet if we listen to what God says about himself, what he says in his word about who he is, from me and through me and to me are all things, then we start looking and we see it everywhere. But if we're talking about what God has said about himself, we need to say one more thing when we're comparing this false God that we make to the true God who reveals himself. You know, when Paul is just singing with tears in his eyes by the time we get here, it's not just because he's come to recognize the God who is the creator. There is a theme that lies at the very heart of all of Paul's preaching. And it's actually at the very first verse of Romans, and it's in the very last verse of Romans, and it's pervasive throughout. And that is this God who is beyond all things, from whom and through whom all things are, whose depths are unfathomable. This God has made himself known in the human being of Jesus Christ. If you know the story of Paul, you might know that he did not always know the true God in the way that he has come to know him since. He thought he did. He was a rabbi. He was someone who passionately sought to serve God. But in hindsight now, he says, what I believed in was a warped, shrunken view of God. And that was always the case until one day when Paul was traveling. Suddenly, out of nothing, from the sky, a bright light appeared to Paul. And it was so terrifying that it brought him down to his knees, face down to the ground, overwhelmed. And he heard his name called from above. And in that moment, where he was utterly being undone, he murmurs out this helpless question. Who are you, Lord? I would suggest, by the way, that if you right now are wrestling with whether to believe in God or not, that's actually the question that you need to ask. Who are you, Lord? And what he hears from the sky is, I am Jesus. And from that moment, everything changed for Paul. From that moment, Paul came to know God in a way that he had never known him before. And he came to understand that in a way that will never be fathomable to us, the God who is beyond everything somehow became one of us, took on flesh, the Son of God, become human being, Jesus. And he lived among us in this world in a way that people could see and talk about and bear witness to. And he died for us. And he rose again and appeared to witnesses. And he did all of this so that we might know this God, and so that we might be brought back to this God. The extraordinary thing that Paul has come to understand as he looks at the face of Jesus is that he sees God, and specifically he sees a God who loves him. Again, I want to say what I said at the very beginning. I'm not expecting that at the end of this time this morning, all doubts are dispelled, everything is clear. That's not how things work this side of Christ's return. But what I want to encourage you to consider this morning is if you are finding yourself wrestling with uncertainty, and you're trying to think of who God is, please don't expect some cheap substitute for God. Turn your attention to the true God, the one that Scripture speaks of, the one who is beyond our understanding, the one who is from whom and through whom and to whom are all things. If you are wanting to wrestle with this rightly, turn your attention to where God has shown himself most clearly, and that is in the person of Jesus. Turn your attention to Jesus if you are doubting. Look at him as he's described in the Gospels, in these accounts. Consider what it is that he says. Consider who he is in his activities. Consider what he does. And recognize as you are looking at this, that according to Scripture, as you are looking at him, you are looking at God. Do you believe in him? And let me suggest that if you do that, if you spend time just looking and seeking to understand and gazing at Jesus as he is shown in the scripture, it's not just to the point of believing that God will bring you, but to the point of awe and wonder and amazement at the glory of God that has shone in the face of his Son. And perhaps you, like me, like many, will conclude in the way that Paul does at the end of this song, "To him be glory forever." Right now, I'd like to invite all of us to turn our attention towards God, towards the God who is beyond us, towards the God who is so extraordinary, yet to the God who became one of us to bring us to himself. Let's turn to him, and where we have turned away from God this week, let's spend some time confessing our sins, asking God for help, and then I'll lead us in prayer in a couple